Hey guys, tonight we're talking about how one pharmaceutical company convinced America that an opioid twice as powerful as morphine was basically aspirin. OxyContin hit the market in 1996 with the most audacious lie ever printed on a prescription drug label: lower abuse potential than other opioids. The FDA approved this claim based on 0 clinical trials, 0 long-term studies, and 0 evidence beyond theoretical speculation. Within a decade, this single medication would generate more American deaths than the entire Vietnam War. The company that made it would earn $35 billion, while its owners became one of the wealthiest families on Earth, their names carved into museum wings at the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Harvard University. Those names would later be scrubbed off like bloodstains, but the money stayed exactly where it was. Hundreds of thousands died. Nobody went to prison. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand OxyContin, you first need to understand the Sackler family, because this wasn't some corporate accident or regulatory oversight. This was 3 brothers who built an empire by recognizing a simple truth. Americans will buy anything if you market it correctly, even their own destruction. The story begins in Brooklyn during the 1920s, when Isaac Sackler and his wife Sophie raised 3 sons in a cramped apartment above a grocery store. Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler grew up during the Great Depression, watching their immigrant parents struggle to keep food on the table. Arthur, the eldest, showed an early obsession with success that bordered on pathological. He worked multiple jobs while attending Columbia University, sleeping 4 hours a night, graduating from medical school in 1945. His brothers followed the same path, physicians all 3, but medicine was never the end game. Arthur Sackler understood something his medical school professors didn't. The real money wasn't in treating patients. The real fortune lived in the space between doctor and prescription pad, in that moment when a physician decides which medication to write. He started working at a small advertising agency called William Douglas McAdams in 1947, handling pharmaceutical accounts while maintaining a psychiatry practice at Creedmoor State Hospital. Most doctors kept their medical work separate from business. Arthur saw them as the same thing. Patients were data points. Prescriptions were market opportunities. The Hippocratic Oath was a suggestion. His breakthrough came with Valium in the early 1960s. The drug itself, diazepam, a benzodiazepine tranquilizer, wasn't revolutionary, but Arthur's marketing campaign changed pharmaceutical sales forever. Before Sackler, drug companies marketed primarily to specialists through medical journals and conservative print ads. Arthur went mass market. He purchased full-page spreads in magazines and newspapers. He hired attractive sales representatives to visit doctors' offices bearing gifts, free samples, and glossy brochures. He created the first pharmaceutical advertising campaigns, targeting consumers directly, planting articles in women's magazines about anxiety and stress. The ads showed housewives overwhelmed by daily life, suggesting Valium could restore their peace of mind. The strategy worked beyond anyone's projections. Valium became the first medication in history to reach $100 million in sales, then the first to reach $1 billion. By 1978, Americans were consuming 2.3 billion Valium pills annually, roughly 10 tablets for every person in the country. Arthur Sackler had invented the pharmaceutical blockbuster. He'd proven that medications could be marketed like soap or cigarettes, that desire could be manufactured through repetition and association. The addiction crisis that followed, millions dependent on benzodiazepines, emergency rooms flooded with overdoses, barely registered as a footnote to his success. Arthur collected Chinese art, donated millions to museums, and died wealthy and respected in 1987. His obituary in the New York Times called him a philanthropist and medical advertising pioneer. It mentioned nothing about addiction. But Arthur's real legacy wasn't Valium or museum donations. His true gift to his younger brothers was the blueprint. Mortimer and Raymond had watched Arthur transform pharmaceutical marketing from polite medical communication into psychological warfare. They'd seen him make billions by creating need where none existed, by convincing healthy people they were sick, and sick people that pills were the answer. In 1952, the three brothers had purchased a small, failing pharmaceutical company called Purdue Frederick for $50,000. The company limped along for decades making laxatives and earwax removal solution, generating modest profits while the Sacklers focused on other ventures. Arthur's side of the family eventually split off after his death, but Mortimer and Raymond retained control of Purdue. By the early 1990s, Mortimer and Raymond faced a problem. Both men were in their 70s. Purdue Frederick remained a minor player in the pharmaceutical industry, dwarfed by giants like Pfizer and Merck. The company's best-selling product was a laxative called Senokot. Their combined personal fortune, while substantial, didn't approach the wealth of pharmaceutical titans. The brothers wanted a legacy that matched Arthur's, a product that would define them as more than footnote heirs to his genius. They needed a blockbuster medication, something that could generate billions in revenue and establish Purdue as a major pharmaceutical power. The market research pointed in one direction: pain management. Americans consumed painkillers at staggering rates, but most options had significant limitations. Acetaminophen and ibuprofen worked for mild pain but offered nothing for severe conditions. Morphine and other strong opioids were reserved for cancer patients and post-surgical recovery, prescribed cautiously due to obvious addiction risks. A massive gap existed for moderate to severe chronic pain, back injuries, arthritis, fibromyalgia, the everyday suffering of millions. Whoever could develop a powerful painkiller without morphine stigma would dominate the market. Purdue scientists began experimenting with oxycodone, an opioid developed in Germany in 1916. The drug had been available in immediate-release formulations for decades, but it carried the same addiction warnings as all opioids. The innovation came through reformulation rather than chemistry. Purdue's researchers developed a time-release coating that would slowly release oxycodone over 12 hours instead of all at once. The coating used a wax-based matrix that dissolved gradually in the digestive system, theoretically providing steady pain relief without the peaks and valleys that made opioids so addictive. At least that was the theory. The reality was that nobody had conducted long-term studies on whether time release actually reduced addiction risk. Nobody had tested whether the coating could be easily defeated. Nobody had examined what happened when patients developed tolerance and needed higher doses. Purdue scientists knew they were creating an opioid twice as powerful as morphine. A single 80 mg OxyContin tablet contained enough oxycodone to kill someone who'd never taken opioids before. But the time-release mechanism gave them cover. In 1995, Purdue filed for FDA approval, submitting studies that showed OxyContin effectively managed pain for 12 hours. The clinical trials involved a few hundred patients over several weeks. No long-term addiction studies existed. No abuse potential research was conducted. The FDA application included one crucial paragraph suggesting the time-release formulation might reduce abuse liability compared to immediate-release opioids. This claim appeared in the label text without any supporting clinical evidence, just theoretical speculation that slower onset might be less attractive to addicts. Dr. Curtis Wright, the FDA medical officer reviewing the application, approved this language. The paragraph would become the foundation for Purdue's entire marketing strategy. the scientific-sounding justification for calling OxyContin safer than other opioids. Dr. Wright approved OxyContin in December 1995. Within 18 months, he left the FDA and joined Purdue Pharma as an executive with a starting salary exceeding $400,000 annually, more than triple his government pay. This revolving door between regulator and regulated would later become a focal point of investigations, but in 1996 it barely raised eyebrows. The pharmaceutical industry regularly hired former FDA officials. Everyone did it. The system was designed to facilitate these transitions, with loose ethics rules and no cooling-off periods. Wright's approval had given Purdue exactly what they needed: an opioid they could market as different, safer, revolutionary. The Sacklers began assembling the largest pharmaceutical sales force in American history. Purdue recruited over 600 sales representatives, offering compensation packages that dwarfed industry standards. Base salaries started at $55,000, with bonus potential reaching $240,000 or more based on prescription volume in each territory. The company divided the country into territories based on prescribing patterns, identifying areas with high painkiller usage and doctors known to write liberal prescriptions. Sales reps received extensive training, not primarily on the medication's effects or risks, but on overcoming objections. Purdue's training materials, later revealed in lawsuits, included scripts for dismissing doctors' concerns about addiction. If a physician mentioned worry about opioid abuse, reps were taught to cite the unsupported FDA label language about reduced abuse potential. If doctors asked about addiction rates, reps pulled out a statistic claiming less than 1% of pain patients became addicted to opioids, a figure based on a misinterpreted 5-sentence letter to the New England Journal of Medicine from 1980. The letter described hospitalized patients given opioids for acute pain, not chronic pain patients taking pills at home for months or years. The distinction mattered enormously. Controlled hospital settings with supervised administration bore no resemblance to bottles of pills in medicine cabinets. But Purdue's sales force wasn't paid to explain nuance. They earned bonuses by increasing prescription volume. The marketing budget for OxyContin's launch exceeded anything Purdue had ever attempted. The company spent $200 million in the first 3 years, an astronomical sum for a pharmaceutical company that previously sold laxatives. They produced slick promotional videos showing pain patients regaining their lives, playing with grandchildren, returning to work, smiling. The videos never mentioned addiction. They barely acknowledged OxyContin was an opioid. The branding emphasized relief, freedom, normalcy. Purdue created a promotional campaign built around the number 12, hammering home that twice-daily dosing meant better compliance than medications requiring 4 or 6 daily doses. They distributed thousands of branded items to doctors: OxyContin pens, notepads, coffee mugs, exam room clocks showing 12-hour increments. The Sackler family didn't simply fund this campaign, they micromanaged it. Richard Sackler, Raymond's son and a Purdue executive, pushed for increasingly aggressive marketing tactics. Internal emails later revealed his hands-on approach, demanding sales increases, questioning why certain territories weren't meeting quotas, suggesting new promotional strategies. The Sacklers treated OxyContin like Arthur had treated Valium, as a consumer product requiring consumer marketing techniques. They approved sales contests where the representative who sold the most OxyContin would win tropical vacations or big-screen televisions. They created a speakers bureau that paid doctors thousands of dollars to promote OxyContin at dinner seminars for other physicians. Purdue launched OxyContin nationally in 1996. The first prescriptions went to post-surgical patients and cancer sufferers, populations already familiar with opioid pain management. But Perdue's strategy targeted a much broader market: the millions of Americans suffering from chronic back pain, arthritis, sports injuries, fibromyalgia, conditions previously managed with physical therapy, non-opioid medications, or simply endured. The company's sales representatives visited primary care physicians in small towns, doctors with no specialized pain management training. These were family practitioners who treated colds and diabetes and high blood pressure, suddenly being encouraged to prescribe an opioid as powerful as morphine for chronic conditions. The sales pitch emphasized how easy OxyContin made pain management. No need to refer patients to specialists, no complicated dosing schedules. Just write a prescription and watch your patients feel better. The strategy worked because it aligned with genuine changes in medical thinking about pain. Throughout the 1990s, pain management advocates had pushed for doctors to take suffering more seriously, arguing that undertreated pain was a medical crisis. Professional organizations began promoting pain as the fifth vital sign, alongside blood pressure, temperature, pulse, and respiration. Well-meaning doctors embraced this framework, believing they had a duty to eliminate patients' pain just as aggressively as they would treat infection or high blood pressure. Purdue rode this wave of changing attitudes, positioning OxyContin as the tool that would let doctors fulfill their obligation to end suffering. Nobody asked whether eliminating all pain was realistic or even desirable. Nobody questioned whether chronic pain patients should be on powerful opioids indefinitely. By 1997, just 1 year after launch, OxyContin sales reached $44 million. The number doubled in 1998, then doubled again. Perdue's sales representatives earned massive bonuses as prescription volume skyrocketed. The Sackler family watched their modest pharmaceutical company transform into a profit machine. And in small towns across Appalachia, emergency room doctors started seeing something strange. Young people overdosing on a prescription medication their family doctors had given them for back pain. The chemistry behind OxyContin wasn't revolutionary. Oxycodone had existed since 1916, synthesized in Germany as doctors searched for alternatives to heroin and morphine. The compound worked by binding to opioid receptors in the brain and spinal cord, blocking pain signals while flooding the nervous system with euphoria. Chemically, oxycodone sat between morphine and hydrocodone in potency, roughly 1.5 times stronger than morphine milligram for milligram. This made it devastatingly powerful. A dose that provided pain relief also triggered the same reward pathways as heroin, releasing dopamine and creating the sensation of warmth, contentment, and detachment that made opioids so psychologically addictive. Every pharmacologist understood this. The chemical structure guaranteed it. Perdue's innovation involved coating these oxycodone molecules in a waxy matrix composed of polyethylene oxide and hydroxypropyl methylcellulose. This polymer shell was designed to dissolve gradually as it passed through the digestive tract, releasing oxycodone in controlled increments over 12 hours. The technology itself came from Alza Corporation, which had developed similar time-release systems for other medications. Purdue licensed the delivery system and applied it to oxycodone, creating tablets in multiple strengths: 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 80 milligrams, and eventually 160 milligrams. The highest doses contained enough oxycodone to kill multiple people if taken all at once. The coating was supposed to prevent that, but the coating was laughably easy to defeat. Anyone who crushed the tablet destroyed the time-release mechanism instantly, converting 12 hours of gradual release into one massive dose. Crushing required no special knowledge or equipment. The back of a spoon worked fine. Chewing the tablet accomplished the same thing. Dissolving it in water and injecting the solution bypassed the digestive system entirely, delivering pure oxycodone directly into the bloodstream. Purdue's scientists knew these vulnerabilities existed before the drug reached market. Internal documents later revealed company researchers had discussed abuse potential during development. They simply decided the time-release coating provided enough theoretical protection to justify their marketing claims. The FDA approval process should have caught these problems. Dr. Curtis Wright reviewed Purdue's application along with other FDA medical officers throughout 1995. The clinical trials Purdue submitted involved 673 patients total, studied for periods ranging from a few days to several weeks. None of the trials examined addiction rates. None tested whether patients developed tolerance requiring higher doses. None investigated what happened when people took OxyContin for months or years. The studies measured one thing: whether the medication reduced pain for 12 hours. On that narrow question, the trial showed modest success. Patients reported lower pain scores, though many required dosing every 8 hours rather than 12 to maintain relief. Purdue's application included the crucial paragraph claiming the time-release formulation is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug. This single sentence appeared in the proposed label text without any supporting clinical data. The phrase, "is believed," carried no scientific weight. It was speculation presented as fact. The reasoning suggested that because the medication released slowly, it would produce less euphoria and therefore attract fewer addicts. This logic ignored fundamental pharmacology. Opioid addiction doesn't primarily stem from rapid onset. It develops from repeated exposure to molecules that hijack the brain's reward system. Whether that exposure happens quickly or slowly over 12 hours, the oxycodone still reaches the same receptors and creates the same dependencies. Wright approved the application anyway. His review acknowledged the lack of addiction studies, noted the theoretical abuse deterrent of time-release formulation, and concluded that labeling should reflect this reduced abuse potential compared to immediate-release opioids. The decision gave Purdue exactly what they needed: official FDA language suggesting OxyContin was safer. The label that went on every bottle included Wright's approved text about the time-release formulation being believed to reduce abuse liability. Purdue's marketing department would weaponize this phrase, stripping away the cautious "is believed" qualifier and presenting it as established fact. In January 1997, 14 months after approving OxyContin, Curtis Wright began negotiating his employment with Purdue Pharma. By June 1998, he had officially joined the company as Executive Director of Research and Development with a salary of $379,000, more than triple his FDA income of $100,000. He also received Purdue stock options and bonuses tied to OxyContin sales. Wright's role at Purdue involved managing the very research programs that should have been required before FDA approval: long-term safety studies, addiction monitoring, abuse potential analysis. He was essentially being paid to conduct the studies he should have demanded as a regulator. The arrangement stank of corruption, but no laws were broken. FDA ethics rules allowed officials to join pharmaceutical companies after leaving government service. No cooling-off period existed. No restrictions prevented regulators from approving drugs made by their future employers. Wright wasn't the only government official whose career benefited from OxyContin's approval. FDA reviewers who worked on the application later found lucrative consulting positions with pharmaceutical companies. The revolving door between regulatory agencies and the industry they regulated wasn't unique to opioids. It defined the entire pharmaceutical oversight system. Officials spent a few years at the FDA earning modest salaries, then leveraged their connections and expertise into six-figure corporate positions. This created obvious incentives to keep industry partners happy, to approve applications without demanding excessive testing, to accept theoretical safety arguments in place of clinical evidence. Purdue began manufacturing OxyContin at their plant in Totowa, New Jersey. The production process involved mixing oxycodone hydrochloride powder with the polymer coating materials, then compressing the mixture into tablets using industrial presses. Quality control tested for proper dosing and coating integrity, ensuring the time-release mechanism would function as designed. What they didn't test for was how easily patients could circumvent the coating. Manufacturing ran 24 hours daily by late 1996, producing millions of tablets monthly. The 80 milligram pills, dark green, oval-shaped, stamped with OC on one side and 80 on the other, would become the most sought-after prescription medication in American history. The marketing campaign launched with scientific-sounding claims rooted in that single FDA-approved sentence. Purdue sales representatives told doctors that OxyContin had less abuse potential than other opioids. They distributed literature citing the time-release mechanism as a safety feature. They showed doctors charts and graphs suggesting addiction occurred in less than 1% of pain patients treated with opioids. This statistic came from a 1980 letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, written by Dr. Herschel Jick and his assistant Jane Porter. The letter, titled "Addiction Rare in Patients Treated with Narcotics," reviewed medical records of 11,882 hospitalized patients who received at least one opioid medication. Among these patients, only 4 cases of addiction developed in patients with no prior addiction history. The letter was 5 sentences long. It specifically described hospitalized patients receiving carefully monitored opioid injections for acute pain following surgery or injury. These were controlled medical settings with professional oversight, short-term use, and selected patient populations. The finding said nothing about chronic pain patients taking pills at home for months or years. The study wasn't designed to measure addiction rates and never claimed to. It was an observation, not research. Yet Purdue transformed this 5-sentence letter into the foundation of their safety claims, citing it in promotional materials and training sales representatives to quote it when doctors expressed addiction concerns. The pharmaceutical industry's relationship with medical literature had always involved creative interpretation, but Purdue elevated citation manipulation to an art form. They funded continuing medical education courses that taught doctors about pain management while promoting OxyContin. These courses presented the Jick and Porter letter alongside other cherry-picked research to create a narrative that prescription opioid addiction was extremely rare. They sponsored medical conferences and symposiums where paid speakers downplayed addiction risks. They distributed reprints of journal articles discussing undertreatment of pain, attaching promotional materials for OxyContin. Every piece of literature reinforced the same message. Pain was undertreated, opioids were safe, addiction fears were exaggerated. Purdue created promotional videos that primary care doctors could play in waiting rooms. The videos featured actors portraying pain patients whose lives had been transformed by proper pain management. Smiling grandparents played with children. Construction workers returned to job sites. Office workers sat comfortably at desks. The implicit message suggested untreated pain was the crisis, not opioid prescriptions. One video showed a woman with arthritis who couldn't garden before starting OxyContin, now happily planting flowers. Another featured a man with back pain from a workplace injury, shown coaching his son's little league team after his doctor prescribed adequate pain medication. The word opioid rarely appeared. Addiction never did. The sales force received detailed instruction on identifying and targeting high-prescribing doctors. Purdue purchased data from pharmacies showing which physicians wrote the most prescriptions for painkillers. Sales representatives used this information to focus their efforts on doctors already comfortable prescribing opioids, knowing these physicians would be easiest to convert to OxyContin. The company divided these high prescribers into tiers, with the top tier receiving the most attention: free lunches, conference invitations, and promotional materials. Representatives tracked their success by monitoring prescription data, seeing in real time which doctors were writing more OxyContin scripts and adjusting their strategies accordingly. Bonus structures incentivized pushing higher doses. Sales representatives earned larger commissions when doctors prescribed 80 milligrams or 160 milligrams tablets versus 10 milligrams or 20 milligrams doses. This created financial motivation to encourage dose escalation, to suggest that patients who weren't getting adequate relief should try stronger pills rather than alternative treatments. Training materials taught representatives to frame higher doses as better pain management rather than increased addiction risk. The talking points emphasized that opioid tolerance was normal, that needing higher doses over time simply meant the pain was severe, that undertreating pain was the real medical error. Purdue sales representatives visited doctors' offices bearing gifts that trivialized the power of the medication they promoted. OxyContin-branded fishing hats, music CDs featuring songs about pain relief, plush toys, coffee mugs stamped with a 12-hour dosing reminder. The company produced a promotional swing music CD titled Get in the Swing with OxyContin, featuring 1940s-style jazz songs. They distributed it to thousands of physicians, suggesting pain management could be carefree and upbeat, something to literally sing about. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, marketing an opioid as powerful as morphine with the same techniques used to sell soft drinks. The Speakers Bureau became Purdue's most effective marketing tool. The company recruited doctors to give paid presentations at dinner seminars for other physicians, offering $2,000 to $3,000 per talk, plus travel expenses and meals at upscale restaurants. These speakers received training from Purdue on key messaging points, presentation slides filled with company-approved data, and talking points for addressing addiction concerns. The format allowed Purdue to promote OxyContin through what appeared to be peer-to-peer medical education. Doctors trusted other doctors more than pharmaceutical sales representatives, so having a local physician recommend OxyContin carried immense weight. Many speakers genuinely believed they were educating colleagues about legitimate pain management. They'd seen patients benefit from opioid therapy and wanted to share those successes. But Purdue selected speakers who would deliver their preferred message, compensated them generously, and tracked whether their talks led to increased prescriptions in the area. Doctors who gave presentations that boosted sales received more speaking invitations and higher fees. Those whose talks didn't move prescription numbers found themselves quietly dropped from the program. The economic incentives shaped medical opinion without most participants even recognizing the manipulation. By 1999, 3 years after launch, OxyContin sales reached $1.1 billion annually. Purdue had become the fastest-growing pharmaceutical company in America. The Sackler family's net worth surged past $5 billion. Richard Sackler, serving as president of Purdue, sent an email to executives celebrating their success and demanding more. Sales representatives who exceeded quotas received bonuses exceeding $100,000. The company expanded manufacturing capacity, hired more representatives, and increased marketing budgets. Everything pointed upward: sales, profits, market share, prescriptions. Emergency room physicians in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia started seeing patients arriving in withdrawal, desperately seeking OxyContin prescriptions. Young people with no history of drug abuse showed up looking skeletal, exhibiting classic opioid addiction symptoms. Pharmacies reported a surge in OxyContin prescriptions, often written by the same small group of doctors. Police noticed increasing numbers of pharmacy robberies specifically targeting the medication. By early 2000, medical examiners in rural Appalachian counties were listing oxycodone as cause of death in overdose cases with alarming frequency. The pill bottles next to the bodies said OxyContin. They said Purdue Pharma. They said less abuse potential. The company received reports of these problems through multiple channels. Sales representatives heard stories from pharmacists about suspicious prescriptions. Medical examiners contacted Purdue directly about overdose deaths. The DEA began investigating unusual distribution patterns. Purdue's response was to collect this information, file it in databases, and continue marketing exactly as before. Internal emails later revealed executives discussed abuse in Maine, discussed overdoses in Virginia, discussed diversion in Florida, then immediately pivoted to discussing sales strategies for those same markets. The deaths were noted, filed, and ignored. Purdue established an internal group called the Adverse Event Reporting Department to track problems with OxyContin. This team documented thousands of reports: overdoses, addiction cases, pharmacy thefts, doctor shopping patterns. Federal regulations required pharmaceutical companies to report adverse events to the FDA, and Purdue complied with these minimal legal obligations. But the company treated adverse event reports as a defensive legal necessity, rather than a signal that their medication was causing catastrophic harm. The same executives reading reports of teenagers dying from OxyContin overdoses were simultaneously pushing sales teams to increase prescriptions in those teenagers' communities. The FDA-approved label included standard warnings about opioid addiction, respiratory depression, and overdose risk. Purdue followed the letter of regulatory requirements by including these warnings in package inserts and promotional materials. But the company's marketing overwhelmed these cautionary notes with the dominant message that OxyContin was different, safer, less prone to abuse. Sales representatives were trained to acknowledge the warnings if asked, then immediately redirect to the time release mechanism and the less than 1% addiction statistic. The legal warnings became camouflage, allowing Purdue to claim they'd properly informed doctors about risks, while their entire marketing apparatus communicated the opposite message. The Sacklers personally reviewed sales data and pushed for expansion into new markets. Family members served on Purdue's board of directors, attended strategy meetings, and received detailed financial reports showing exactly how much money OxyContin generated. They weren't distant investors unaware of the business. They were hands-on owners who demanded growth and profit. Documents later revealed in litigation showed Richard Sackler specifically requesting updates on sales efforts, questioning why certain territories weren't meeting projections, and suggesting promotional tactics. The family treated OxyContin like Arthur Sackler had treated Valium, as a commercial product requiring aggressive marketing regardless of medical consequences. The medical community bears responsibility for accepting Purdue's marketing without sufficient skepticism. Thousands of doctors prescribed OxyContin for chronic pain conditions that had previously been managed without opioids. They wrote prescriptions based on pharmaceutical company literature, sales representative claims, and paid speaker presentations rather than independent research. Medical schools provided minimal training in addiction medicine or pain management, leaving doctors unprepared to recognize opioid dependence developing in their patients. The combination of inadequate medical education, aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, and genuine desire to help suffering patients created the perfect conditions for an epidemic. But while doctors prescribed the medication, Purdue designed and executed the system that made mass prescribing inevitable. They created the marketing materials that misrepresented addiction risks. They funded the medical education that downplayed opioid dangers. They paid the speakers who influenced prescribing practices. They targeted the specific doctors most likely to write high-volume prescriptions. They incentivized their sales force to push higher doses and broader use. Every element of the strategy was calculated to maximize prescriptions, maximize dosage strength, and maximize revenue. The Sacklers and Purdue executives knew they were marketing an addictive opioid. They simply decided the profit justified the risk. The bodies piling up in small-town morgues suggested they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Purdue's sales force operated with the precision and ruthlessness of a military campaign targeting America's most vulnerable communities. The company assembled detailed profiles of every physician in the country who might prescribe painkillers, purchasing prescription data from pharmacies and medical records companies to identify the highest volume prescribers. This information revealed which doctors wrote the most opioid prescriptions, which patients received the largest quantities, and which geographic areas showed the greatest demand for pain medications. Sales representatives received this intelligence broken down by zip code, allowing them to focus on specific neighborhoods where painkiller use was already established. The strategy wasn't to find doctors cautiously treating severe pain. It was to identify physicians already writing liberal prescriptions and convert them to OxyContin. Primary care doctors in rural Appalachia became Purdue's prime targets. These physicians worked in small towns with limited access to specialists, treating coal miners with crushed vertebrae, factory workers with repetitive stress injuries, and aging populations with arthritis and chronic conditions. Most had no specialized training in pain management or addiction medicine. Medical school had taught them basic pharmacology, but little about the neuroscience of opioid dependence or the warning signs of addiction developing in their patients. They practiced in communities where economic despair and lack of opportunity had already created substance abuse problems. Methamphetamine use was epidemic in many rural areas by the late 1990s. Adding powerful prescription opioids to this environment was like pouring gasoline on smoldering coals. Purdue sales representatives visited these doctors bearing gifts, free lunch, and persuasive literature about undertreated pain. The company had identified that rural physicians often felt overwhelmed by patient suffering they couldn't adequately address. The miner whose back pain prevented him from working, the waitress whose arthritis made every shift agony. OxyContin sales reps positioned the medication as the solution to these doctors' frustrations, a tool that would let them help patients they'd previously had to turn away or refer to distant specialists. The pitch emphasized simplicity. Write a prescription. Watch your patient improve. No complicated interventions required. For overworked doctors seeing 30 patients daily in understaffed clinics, this message resonated powerfully. The bonus structure Purdue created for its sales force revealed the company's true priorities. Representatives earned base salaries around $55,000, competitive but unremarkable for pharmaceutical sales. The bonuses, however, could exceed $240,000 annually, more than quadruple base pay. These bonuses were calculated based on total prescription volume in each representative's territory, with additional multipliers for higher strength tablets. A rep whose doctors prescribed 110 mg OxyContin tablets earned far less than a rep whose doctors prescribed 180 mg tablets, even though both represented the same number of prescriptions. This incentivized sales representatives to push patients toward higher doses, suggesting to doctors that inadequate pain relief meant the patient needed stronger pills rather than alternative treatments. Purdue tracked prescription data with frightening precision. The company purchased information from IMS Health, a data analytics firm that collected prescription records from pharmacies nationwide. This allowed Purdue to monitor individual doctors' prescribing patterns in real time, seeing exactly who wrote prescriptions for OxyContin, in what quantities, at what dosages. Sales representatives received weekly updates showing their territory's numbers compared to other regions. Managers pushed reps whose territories underperformed, demanding explanations and strategies for improvement. The system created constant pressure to increase prescriptions, with job security and income tied directly to getting more doctors to write more OxyContin scripts at higher doses. The company developed a tiered classification system for doctors based on prescribing volume. Lower-tier physicians who rarely prescribed opioids received minimal attention, perhaps 1 or 2 visits annually from sales representatives. Mid-tier doctors who prescribed moderate amounts got quarterly visits and occasional promotional materials. The top tier, physicians who prescribed opioids liberally and frequently, received intensive cultivation. Sales reps visited these doctors weekly, bringing lunch for the entire office staff, providing free samples, inviting them to paid speaking engagements and conferences. Purdue called these high prescribers key opinion leaders, though many were simply doctors willing to write prescriptions with minimal oversight. One internal Purdue document described the goal as creating a blizzard of prescriptions. Sales managers used this phrase in motivational meetings, urging representatives to generate so many OxyContin prescriptions that the medication became the default treatment for pain in their territories. The company distributed promotional items on a staggering scale. Hundreds of thousands of OxyContin-branded pens, notepads, coffee mugs, clocks, clipboards, and examining room supplies flooded medical offices across America. Every item featured the OxyContin logo and 12-hour dosing reminder, creating constant visual reinforcement. Doctors wrote prescriptions on OxyContin notepads with OxyContin pens, while checking OxyContin clocks to see if 12 hours had elapsed since the last dose. Purdue's marketing extended beyond individual doctor visits to lavish conferences and seminars held at resort destinations. The company sponsored pain management symposiums in Arizona, Florida, and California, paying for doctors' travel, hotel accommodations, meals, and entertainment, while presenting educational content that promoted OxyContin. These multi-day events featured golf outings, spa treatments, and fine dining alongside medical lectures. Purdue selected speakers who would deliver company-friendly messages about the safety of long-term opioid therapy and the importance of aggressive pain treatment. Doctors attended what felt like professional education while essentially receiving an all-expenses-paid vacation funded by pharmaceutical company marketing budgets. The Speakers Bureau program grew to include hundreds of physicians nationwide, each compensated $2,000 to $3,000 per presentation plus expenses. Purdue provided these doctors with slide decks, talking points, and suggested responses to common questions about addiction and abuse. The presentations followed a formula: emphasize undertreated pain as a crisis, cite the misleading less than 1% addiction statistic, highlight OxyContin's time-release mechanism as a safety feature, and encourage colleagues to prescribe more liberally. Speakers gave these presentations at dinner seminars attended by local physicians, who enjoyed free meals at upscale restaurants, while hearing about OxyContin from trusted peers rather than sales representatives. Purdue tracked which speakers generated the most prescription increases in their areas. Doctors whose talks correlated with surging OxyContin sales received more speaking invitations and opportunities to present at larger, more prestigious events. Those whose presentations failed to move the needle found themselves excluded from future programs. The company wasn't paying for medical education. They were paying for marketing that worked, and they monitored results to ensure their investment produced returns. Many participating doctors genuinely believed they were educating colleagues about legitimate pain management, unaware that Purdue had selected and compensated them specifically because their message aligned with company interests. The company produced a 40-minute promotional video titled, "I Got My Life Back. Patients in Pain Tell Their Story," featuring actors portraying chronic pain patients whose lives improved after starting OxyContin. The video showed a woman with osteoarthritis swimming in a pool, a man with back pain playing basketball with his son, and an elderly man with cancer pain enjoying a family barbecue. Each segment emphasized return to normal activities, pain relief, and improved quality of life. The video mentioned OxyContin's opioid classification only briefly, spending far more time on testimonials about life transformation. Purdue distributed thousands of copies to doctors' offices, suggesting they play it in waiting rooms for patients. This swing music, CD, Get in the Swing with OxyContin, represented pharmaceutical marketing at its most surreal. Purdue commissioned original songs in 1940s, big band style with lyrics about pain relief, distributing the CD to doctors as a promotional gift. The music was upbeat and cheerful, transforming serious pain management into something light and entertaining. One track featured lyrics about feeling good again, another about getting back to living. The CD turned a medication as powerful as morphine into background music for medical offices, trivializing the very real risks while associating the brand with positive emotions and nostalgic aesthetics. Purdue created OxyContin-branded fishing hats, distributed at medical conferences and given to high-prescribing physicians. The hats bore the OxyContin logo prominently, turning doctors into walking advertisements during their leisure time. The company produced plush toy bears wearing OxyContin t-shirts, given to physicians to display in their offices. These toys sat on reception desks and examination room shelves, visible to every patient who entered. The message was clear. OxyContin was friendly, approachable, safe enough to be represented by a stuffed animal. The cognitive dissonance of marketing a Schedule II controlled substance, the same classification as cocaine and methamphetamine, with children's toys would become evidence in later litigation. Sales representatives received training on overcoming specific objections doctors might raise. If a physician mentioned concerns about addiction, reps were instructed to cite the FDA-approved label language about reduced abuse potential. If doctors worried about respiratory depression, the mechanism by which opioids kill through overdose, representatives emphasized the time-release formulation as a safety feature. If physicians questioned whether chronic non-cancer pain patients should be on long-term opioids, sales reps framed this hesitation as allowing patients to suffer needlessly, invoking the pain as the fifth vital sign campaign and suggesting that undertreating pain was tantamount to medical malpractice. The company developed what they called detailing aids, visual materials sales representatives used during doctor visits to illustrate key points. These included charts comparing OxyContin to other pain medications, graphs showing patient satisfaction scores, and diagrams explaining the time-release mechanism. One particularly effective detailing aid showed a timeline of pain relief, comparing the peaks and valleys of immediate-release opioids to OxyContin's supposed steady 12-hour coverage. The visual suggested OxyContin provided superior, more consistent pain relief, though clinical reality often showed patients needed dosing every 8 hours rather than 12 to maintain adequate analgesia. Purdue's marketing materials rarely mentioned that OxyContin was an opioid in the same chemical family as heroin. Sales representatives avoided using the word narcotic despite it being the technical classification. Marketing brochures emphasized around-the-clock pain relief and improved quality of life, without dwelling on the fact that the active ingredient was a semi-synthetic version of compounds derived from opium poppies. This strategic language minimized mental associations between OxyContin and illegal drugs, allowing doctors and patients to think of it as fundamentally different from street opioids, despite nearly identical chemical effects on the brain. The company expanded its sales force to more than 600 representatives by 2000, making it one of the largest pharmaceutical sales operations in the country. For comparison, Most drugs were marketed by teams of 100 to 200 representatives. Purdue devoted unprecedented resources to OxyContin promotion, outspending competitors by massive margins. The company's marketing budget reached $200 million in the first few years, exponentially larger than their spending on any previous product. This investment paid off spectacularly. OxyContin sales grew from $45 million in 1996 to $1.1 billion in 2000, making it one of the fastest-growing pharmaceutical products in history. Regional sales managers held monthly meetings where representatives shared successful tactics and strategies for increasing prescriptions. These sessions became competitions, with reps describing their highest-performing doctors and techniques for converting physicians who initially resisted prescribing OxyContin. Managers celebrated top performers with awards, bonuses, and recognition. The culture emphasized sales above all else, with minimal discussion of the addiction crisis beginning to emerge in territories where OxyContin prescribing had reached saturation levels. If representatives heard troubling stories about abuse or addiction, company policy was to document these reports and forward them to legal and compliance departments, then continue maximizing sales. Purdue purchased advertising in medical journals, glossy spreads showing pain patients engaged in activities they'd previously been unable to enjoy. These ads appeared in publications like the Journal of the American Medical Association and specialty pain management journals, lending scientific credibility to what were essentially product promotions. The advertisements cited the same misleading statistics and emphasized the time-release mechanism while minimizing addiction risks. Doctors reading peer-reviewed medical journals encountered OxyContin marketing seamlessly integrated with research articles, blurring the line between scientific evidence and pharmaceutical advertising. The company developed relationships with patient advocacy groups focused on chronic pain, providing funding that allowed these organizations to expand their outreach and lobbying efforts. Groups like the American Pain Foundation received millions from Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies, money that supported campaigns emphasizing undertreated pain as a crisis requiring more aggressive opioid prescribing. These advocacy organizations presented themselves as patient-driven grassroots movements, but Purdue's funding ensured their messaging aligned with company interests. The partnerships gave Purdue's marketing credibility. When patient groups called for more liberal opioid prescribing, it appeared to be suffering patients demanding relief rather than pharmaceutical companies seeking profits. Purdue targeted specific medical specialties beyond primary care, reaching out to orthopedic surgeons, dentists, and emergency room physicians. The company recognized that any doctor who could write prescriptions represented a potential revenue stream. Dental surgeries for wisdom teeth extraction became common sources of OxyContin prescriptions, with young people receiving bottles of powerful opioids for routine procedures that had previously been managed with ibuprofen. High school and college students filled these prescriptions, often taking 1 or 2 pills, then leaving the rest in medicine cabinets, where they could be diverted, shared, or discovered by siblings and friends. The company's annual sales conferences brought together top-performing representatives for multi-day celebrations at luxury resorts. These events featured motivational speakers, awards ceremonies, and presentations from Purdue executives, including members of the Sackler family. Representatives who achieved the highest sales increases received vacations, electronics, and significant cash bonuses. The conferences reinforced company culture centered on aggressive promotion and sales maximization, with minimal attention to growing evidence of addiction and overdose problems. Success was measured purely in prescription volume and revenue, not patient outcomes or public health impact. Richard Sackler personally communicated with sales and marketing teams, sending emails pushing for increased market penetration and questioning why certain regions weren't meeting growth targets. Internal emails later revealed in litigation showed Sackler reviewing detailed sales data and demanding explanations when numbers fell short of projections. He wasn't a distant owner collecting dividends. He was actively managing strategy and holding executives accountable for revenue growth. Other family members served on Purdue's board of directors, attending quarterly meetings where they reviewed financials, approved budgets, and set corporate strategy. The Sacklers knew exactly how the company made its money. By 2001, OxyContin had become Purdue's entire business. The medication generated more than 90% of the company's revenue, transforming what had been a modest pharmaceutical manufacturer into a multi-billion-dollar operation. The Sackler family's personal wealth surged past $10 billion, making them one of the richest families in America. They donated millions to museums, universities, and cultural institutions, with their name appearing on wings at the Guggenheim, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Harvard. The philanthropy brought social prestige and public goodwill, positioning the Sacklers as cultured benefactors rather than pharmaceutical executives whose product was killing thousands. Emergency rooms across Appalachia were drowning in OxyContin-related cases. Doctors in eastern Kentucky reported seeing multiple overdoses weekly, young people arriving unconscious with dangerously suppressed breathing. Medical examiners in Virginia documented increasing numbers of deaths involving oxycodone, often in combination with alcohol or benzodiazepines. Police departments noticed surges in pharmacy robberies, with thieves specifically targeting OxyContin and ignoring other controlled substances. The pattern was unmistakable. A prescription medication marketed as safe was destroying communities. Purdue received reports of these problems from multiple sources: sales representatives, pharmacists, law enforcement, medical examiners. The company documented everything and changed nothing. Sales kept climbing. The Sacklers kept getting richer. The bodies kept piling up. The geography of America's opioid crisis wasn't random. It followed the precise path of Purdue's marketing strategy. Counties in eastern Kentucky, western Virginia, and West Virginia showed the highest OxyContin prescription rates per capita by 2000. Not coincidentally the same regions where Purdue had concentrated its sales force. Mingo County, West Virginia, population 28,000, had enough OxyContin prescribed annually to supply every resident with dozens of pills. Portsmouth, Ohio, a town of 20,000 people, supported over 40 pain clinics by 2003. These weren't medical centers. They were prescription mills operating purely for profit, writing OxyContin scripts for anyone willing to pay cash. The pill mills worked with brutal efficiency. Patients arrived at strip mall clinics, filled out minimal paperwork claiming chronic pain, saw a doctor for 3 minutes, and walked out with prescriptions for 120 OxyContin tablets, plus muscle relaxers and anxiety medications. No physical examination occurred. No medical records were reviewed. No alternative treatments were discussed. The entire interaction was a financial transaction disguised as medical care. Doctors running these operations earned millions annually, seeing 100 patients daily at $200 to $300 per visit. Lines formed outside clinics before dawn, people traveling from neighboring states to access the prescription assembly line. The economics made perfect sense for everyone involved except the patients. Doctors earned extraordinary income with minimal effort. Pharmacies filled thousands of prescriptions monthly, collecting fees from insurance companies or cash from uninsured patients. Purdue sold massive quantities of OxyContin to distributors supplying these high-volume markets. Pharmaceutical wholesalers like Cardinal Health and McKesson shipped millions of pills to tiny towns, watching their distribution numbers explode without questioning why a pharmacy, in a community of 2,500 people, suddenly needed 500,000 oxycodone tablets annually. Everyone profited. The money flowed upstream from desperate patients to corporate bank accounts. But patients discovered something Purdue's chemists had known all along. The time-release coating was laughably easy to defeat. Crushing an 80 mg OxyContin tablet with a pill crusher, mortar and pestle, or even the back of a spoon destroyed the wax matrix instantly. The powder could then be snorted like cocaine, delivering the entire 12-hour dose in minutes. The rush was immediate and overwhelming, equivalent to injecting heroin. Users described a warm wave washing over their entire body, anxiety dissolving, pain vanishing, euphoria flooding in. The high lasted several hours, then crashed hard, leaving users desperately craving another pill. Some users went further, dissolving crushed OxyContin in water or saline solution to create an injectable liquid. This method bypassed the digestive system entirely, sending pure oxycodone directly into the bloodstream. The effect was even more intense than snorting. A few seconds after injection, the opioid hit the brain with full force. For people chasing the ultimate high, injection became the preferred method despite dramatically increased overdose risk. Used needles began appearing in public restrooms, parking lots, and parks across rural America. HIV and hepatitis C transmission rates spiked in communities with no previous intravenous drug use problems. The street market for OxyContin developed its own economy and culture. Pills sold for roughly $1 per milligram. An 80 milligram tablet fetched $60 to $80, making a prescription for 120 pills worth $7,200 to $9,600 on the black market. People with legitimate pain prescriptions discovered they could sell their medication for more than most earned in a month of work. Others began doctor shopping, visiting multiple physicians to accumulate prescriptions from different sources, filling them at various pharmacies to avoid detection. Some patients presented the same MRI, showing spinal damage to a dozen doctors, each writing a separate OxyContin prescription. Pharmacy robberies surged 400% in Kentucky and Ohio between 2000 and 2003. Thieves weren't interested in cash registers. They wanted the pharmacy safe where Schedule II controlled substances were stored. Robbers specifically demanded OxyContin, often ignoring other opioids sitting on the same shelves. Armed robberies became so common that pharmacies in some towns hired security guards and installed bulletproof glass. Smaller independent pharmacies stopped stocking OxyContin entirely after repeated break-ins, but this simply concentrated prescriptions at larger chain pharmacies that could afford security measures. The addiction progression followed a predictable pattern. Patients typically started with legitimate prescriptions for genuine pain, a workplace injury, surgery recovery, chronic back problems. The OxyContin worked initially, providing real pain relief alongside euphoria the patients didn't necessarily recognize as problematic. After several weeks, tolerance developed. The same dose no longer controlled pain or produced the same pleasant feeling. Patients returned to doctors requesting higher doses, often encountering physicians who'd been trained by Purdue's marketing to interpret inadequate relief as undertreated pain requiring stronger medication. Doses escalated from 10 milligrams twice daily to 40 milligrams, then 80 milligrams, then multiple 80 milligrams tablets per day. Patients who'd started OxyContin for legitimate pain found themselves physically dependent within months, experiencing withdrawal symptoms, sweating, muscle aches, nausea, anxiety, insomnia, if they missed doses. The line between pain management and addiction blurred until it disappeared entirely. People who'd never touched illegal drugs found themselves crushing pills and snorting them, not for euphoria but to avoid the agony of withdrawal. Physical dependence had trapped them in a cycle requiring constant medication just to feel normal. When prescriptions ran out early due to escalating use, patients faced impossible choices. Withdrawal from high-dose opioids produces symptoms often described as worse than severe flu. Violent muscle spasms, vomiting, diarrhea, bone-deep aches, profound depression, and overwhelming drug craving. Most people couldn't endure it. They sought more pills through any means available. Doctor shopping, buying from dealers, stealing from family members' medicine cabinets, trading sex or possessions for pills. The desperation drove previously law-abiding citizens to criminal behavior they'd never imagined possible. Families disintegrated under opioid addiction's weight. Parents sold possessions to buy pills, neglecting children who often ended up in foster care. Teenagers raided grandparents' medicine cabinets, starting addiction patterns that would define their lives. Couples who'd been together for decades divorced after one partner's addiction drained bank accounts and destroyed trust. Siblings stopped speaking after thefts and betrayals. The social fabric of small towns unraveled as addiction touched every family, every workplace, every church congregation. Emergency rooms in Appalachian communities became de facto addiction treatment centers, seeing the same patients repeatedly for overdoses, infections from dirty needles, and withdrawal symptoms. Doctors and nurses worked double shifts treating opioid-related emergencies while their own communities collapsed. Some emergency department physicians became numb to the suffering, viewing addicted patients as nuisances taking resources from people with real medical problems. Others burned out emotionally from watching young people die preventable deaths, bodies arriving too late for naloxone to reverse the overdose. Medical examiners in counties across Appalachia noticed oxycodone appearing in toxicology reports with increasing frequency. Deaths previously attributed to unknown causes, or heart failure, were actually opioid overdoses once proper testing was performed. The mechanism of death was respiratory depression. Oxycodone binds to receptors in the brainstem that control breathing, and at high enough doses breathing simply stops. Victims were found in cars parked at convenience stores, in bathroom stalls at fast food restaurants, slumped in recliners at home. Many died alone, unconscious before they could call for help. The typical overdose victim was getting younger. Early deaths involved chronic pain patients who'd accidentally taken too much medication or mixed OxyContin with alcohol or benzodiazepines, creating lethal combinations. By 2002, medical examiners were seeing teenagers and young adults with no documented pain conditions, people who'd started using OxyContin recreationally and progressed to fatal overdoses within months. A pattern emerged. Young person tries OxyContin at a party or receives a prescription after wisdom teeth extraction, discovers the euphoric effects, begins seeking more pills, escalates to crushing and snorting, overdoses within 6 to 18 months. The foster care system in Kentucky and West Virginia became overwhelmed with children removed from homes where parents were too addicted to provide basic care. Caseworkers discovered children living in houses without food, utilities shut off, surrounded by used needles and pill bottles. Grandparents in their 60s and 70s found themselves raising grandchildren because their own adult children had become non-functional addicts. The generational damage rippled outward, creating cycles of trauma and instability that would affect communities for decades. Babies born to mothers taking OxyContin during pregnancy arrived in neonatal intensive care units, experiencing withdrawal. Neonatal abstinence syndrome caused infants to shake, cry inconsolably, vomit, have seizures, and struggle to feed. Treatment required weeks of hospitalization, gradually weaning babies off opioids using methadone or morphine while providing supportive care. Hospital costs for each case exceeded $100,000. The number of these cases increased 300% between 2000 and 2006 in states hardest hit by OxyContin, creating both a humanitarian crisis and a massive healthcare cost burden. Local law enforcement faced situations they were completely unprepared to handle. Small-town police departments suddenly dealt with organized drug trafficking operations, pharmacy robberies, domestic violence fueled by addiction, and child neglect cases in unprecedented numbers. Sheriffs who'd spent careers managing minor property crimes and occasional bar fights now investigated overdose deaths weekly. Jail populations surged with people arrested for prescription fraud, pharmacy theft, and drug dealing. Counties couldn't afford to build enough jail space or hire enough officers to address the crisis. The judicial system struggled with how to handle prescription opioid crimes. Were addicted individuals criminals deserving punishment or patients needing treatment? Judges sent people to prison for stealing OxyContin prescriptions, only to see them released and immediately overdose. Treatment programs had waiting lists stretching months, assuming any treatment facilities existed in rural areas. Many counties had no addiction services whatsoever, forcing judges to choose between incarceration or releasing addicted defendants back into communities with no support systems. Purdue received detailed reports about the crisis through multiple channels. Sales representatives heard pharmacists complain about suspicious prescriptions and obvious doctor shopping. Medical examiners contacted Purdue directly to report overdose deaths involving OxyContin. The DEA began investigating unusual distribution patterns, questioning why certain pharmacies ordered quantities far exceeding legitimate medical need. Local news coverage documented the epidemic, with newspapers in Kentucky and West Virginia running front-page stories about OxyContin's devastation. All of this information flowed into Purdue's headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. The company established systems to track what they called adverse events, reports of addiction, overdose, death, and diversion. Federal regulations required pharmaceutical manufacturers to maintain these records and report serious adverse events to the FDA. Purdue complied with the minimal legal requirements, filing thousands of reports documenting deaths and addiction cases. But internally, executives treated adverse event reports as legal liability management rather than signals requiring action. The same executives reading reports of teenagers dying from OxyContin were simultaneously pushing sales teams to increase prescriptions in those exact communities. Internal emails later revealed through litigation showed the cognitive dissonance. One Purdue executive wrote about OxyContin abuse problems in Maine, noting concerns from law enforcement and public health officials. The same email chain included discussion of marketing strategies for Maine and celebration of sales increases in the state. Another exchange documented executives discussing overdose deaths in Virginia while planning promotional campaigns targeting Virginia physicians. The pattern repeated across every region where abuse emerged: acknowledge the problem in legal and compliance documents, then aggressively market in those same areas. Richard Sackler sent an email in 2001 suggesting that people who abused OxyContin were criminals attacking Purdue's product, framing addicts as the problem rather than the medication. This perspective, that abuse represented misuse by bad actors rather than a predictable consequence of mass marketing an addictive opioid, pervaded company culture. Purdue's public relations strategy emphasized personal responsibility, suggesting that the medication was safe when used properly, and that addiction primarily affected people with criminal tendencies or pre-existing substance abuse problems. The narrative absolved the company while blaming victims. Purdue continued expanding its sales force and increasing its marketing budget, even as evidence of catastrophic harm accumulated. OxyContin sales reached $1.5 billion in 2001, $1.9 billion in 2002, $2.1 billion in 2003. The Sackler family extracted hundreds of millions annually in profits, moving money through complex networks of trusts and offshore accounts. They donated to museums and universities, attended charity galas, collected art, and lived in mansions while communities in Appalachia disintegrated. The disconnect between their wealth and the suffering that generated it was absolute. By 2004, oxycodone had become the leading cause of accidental death in multiple Appalachian counties, surpassing car accidents. Life expectancy began declining in regions hardest hit by OxyContin, an almost unprecedented demographic shift in a developed nation during peacetime. Entire towns became known primarily for their opioid problems. Portsmouth, Ohio was featured in news coverage as ground zero for prescription pill addiction. The epidemic Purdue had created through aggressive marketing and willful blindness had become undeniable. Yet the company's response remained the same. Document problems in legal files, continue marketing, maximize profits, and wait for someone to force them to stop. The DEA began investigating Purdue in 2001 after field agents in multiple states reported suspicious patterns. Single pharmacies in towns of 3,000 people ordering enough OxyContin to supply cities of 300,000. The agency's Diversion Control Division tracked pharmaceutical distribution, monitoring for anomalies that suggested illegal trafficking. OxyContin's numbers were flashing red across Appalachia and Florida. Pharmacies in rural Virginia that previously ordered 5,000 pills monthly were suddenly requesting 500,000. The mathematical impossibility of legitimate medical use was obvious to anyone examining the data. DEA agents interviewed pharmacists who described customers driving from out of state to fill OxyContin prescriptions, sometimes multiple prescriptions from different doctors on the same day. Surveillance footage showed the same individuals visiting pharmacies repeatedly, filling prescriptions, then immediately getting back in cars with out-of-state license plates. The agency subpoenaed Purdue's distribution records, demanding information about which pharmacies received the largest shipments and whether the company had monitored or questioned these suspicious orders. Purdue's legal team fought every subpoena, delaying production of documents for months while arguing that distribution data was proprietary business information. When documents finally arrived, they revealed Purdue had sophisticated tracking systems showing precisely where every OxyContin tablet shipped. The company knew which pharmacies ordered unusual quantities and which doctors prescribed at rates far exceeding their peers. Internal databases flagged suspicious patterns. A doctor who'd previously written 50 opioid prescriptions monthly suddenly writing 500. Purdue's response wasn't to investigate or cut off supply. Sales representatives were instructed to increase contact with these high-volume prescribers, offering more promotional support and incentives. The doctors generating the most prescriptions received the most attention, regardless of whether those prescriptions serve legitimate medical purposes. Purdue hired private investigators to monitor its critics. When journalists began writing articles about OxyContin abuse, the company deployed investigators to dig through reporters' backgrounds, searching for anything that could discredit their coverage. When pain management doctors expressed concerns about addiction rates, Purdue investigated their medical practices and personal lives. The company hired former law enforcement and intelligence professionals to conduct this opposition research, paying them to build dossiers on anyone who might threaten OxyContin's market dominance. The strategy was intimidation disguised as due diligence. The company simultaneously cultivated relationships with organizations claiming to represent pain patients, funneling millions of dollars to groups that would amplify Purdue's messaging. The American Pain Foundation received substantial funding from Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies, money that supported lobbying efforts against prescription monitoring programs and limits on opioid prescribing. The organization presented itself as a grassroots patient advocacy group, but it functioned essentially as a pharmaceutical industry front, promoting policies that increased opioid sales while claiming to fight for pain patients' rights. These advocacy groups oppose state efforts to implement prescription drug monitoring programs, databases tracking controlled substance prescriptions to identify doctor shopping and overprescribing. The groups argued such programs violated patient privacy and created barriers to pain treatment. Purdue funded this opposition while publicly claiming to support appropriate safeguards. The company wanted to appear responsible while ensuring no actual restrictions limited OxyContin prescribing. Every proposed regulatory measure faced well-funded lobbying campaigns, supported by pharmaceutical money flowing through patient advocacy organizations. Purdue's public relations strategy blamed addiction on criminals misusing a legitimate medication rather than acknowledging their marketing had created the crisis. Company spokespeople gave interviews emphasizing that OxyContin was safe when used as directed, suggesting that abuse occurred primarily among people with criminal tendencies who obtained the medication illegally. This narrative ignored that most people initially received OxyContin through legal prescriptions from licensed physicians before addiction developed. The company treated the epidemic as a crime problem requiring law enforcement solutions rather than a public health catastrophe their marketing had manufactured. Richard Sackler proposed marketing OxyContin for additional medical conditions beyond pain management, suggesting the medication could treat depression and anxiety. Internal documents showed him pushing for expanded indications that would allow marketing to new patient populations, potentially multiplying sales. The fact that OxyContin was causing an addiction epidemic didn't slow the family's appetite for growth. They wanted more markets, more prescriptions, more revenue. Medical and regulatory staff at Purdue pushed back on these proposals, recognizing the liability and ethical problems. But the Sacklers' relentless pursuit of expansion revealed their priorities. The company developed new marketing campaigns targeting elderly patients and veterans, populations often dealing with chronic pain and less likely to be perceived as drug-seeking. Purdue sales representatives visited retirement communities and veterans' hospitals, promoting OxyContin as appropriate long-term therapy for aging bodies and combat-related injuries. The strategy worked. Prescriptions to seniors increased substantially, creating a new category of older Americans physically dependent on opioids. Many elderly patients had reduced liver and kidney function, making opioid overdoses more likely even at prescribed doses, but Purdue's marketing materials minimized these risks. Purdue reformulated OxyContin in 2010, creating an abuse-deterrent version that was harder to crush and dissolve. The company promoted this reformulation as addressing abuse concerns, but the timing revealed different motivations. Purdue's patent on original OxyContin was expiring, which would allow generic manufacturers to produce cheaper versions. The reformulation extended patent protection, blocking generic competition while generating positive public relations about fighting abuse. The new formulation did make crushing more difficult, but it didn't reduce addiction or overdose rates. It simply pushed users toward alternatives. When addicted individuals found they could no longer easily crush OxyContin, many switched to heroin. The opioid epidemic entered a new phase as prescription pill users transitioned to cheaper, more accessible street drugs. Heroin use had been declining for decades, concentrated primarily in major cities. After 2010, heroin markets exploded across rural America as OxyContin users sought substitutes. A bag of heroin cost $10 to $20, far less than an 80 mg OxyContin tablet selling for $80 on the street. The chemical effect was nearly identical. Both drugs activated the same brain receptors, but heroin's illegality and unpredictable purity made overdoses far more common. Purdue's reformulation had pushed the epidemic from prescription pills to illicit drugs without reducing the total number of addicted people. The company claimed this as success, pointing to decreased OxyContin abuse while ignoring that they'd created the addiction-driving heroin use. By 2015, heroin overdose deaths exceeded 12,000 annually, up from 2,000 in 2000. Many of these deaths involved people who'd started with OxyContin prescriptions, been cut off or priced out, and turned to heroin as the only accessible alternative. Purdue bore responsibility for these deaths despite heroin being manufactured and distributed by completely different criminal networks. The company fought prescription monitoring programs in state after state, funding lobbying campaigns that portrayed these databases as government overreach threatening patient privacy. Prescription monitoring would have made doctor shopping nearly impossible, as physicians could check whether patients had recent prescriptions from other providers. This would have disrupted both doctor shopping by addicted individuals and irresponsible prescribing by pill mills. Purdue's opposition to these sensible safeguards revealed the company's priorities. Maximizing sales mattered more than preventing diversion and addiction. When states successfully implemented monitoring programs despite industry opposition, OxyContin prescriptions typically decreased 20 to 40% within the first year. This demonstrated that substantial portions of prescribing had been inappropriate. Doctor shopping, pill mill operations, and overprescribing that monitoring helped reduce. Purdue fought these reductions, instructing sales representatives to work harder in states with new monitoring systems, finding doctors still willing to prescribe liberally despite increased scrutiny. The company treated public health measures as obstacles to overcome rather than necessary safeguards. Purdue funded continuing medical education courses that taught doctors to prescribe opioids more liberally for chronic pain. These courses presented cherry-picked research suggesting long-term opioid therapy was safe and effective, while downplaying studies showing poor outcomes and high addiction rates. Physicians attended what they believed was neutral professional education, unaware that pharmaceutical company funding shaped the content to promote increased prescribing. Medical boards often required doctors to complete continuing education credits to maintain licenses, and Purdue ensured their industry-friendly courses were available to fulfill these requirements. The company created a program called Partners Against Pain that provided doctors with patient education materials, pain assessment tools, and treatment guidelines, all subtly promoting opioid therapy as first-line treatment for chronic conditions. The program appeared to be a public service, offering free resources to overworked physicians. In reality, it was marketing infrastructure designed to increase OxyContin prescribing while appearing educational and benign. Hundreds of thousands of doctors incorporated these materials into their practices, not recognizing they were implementing pharmaceutical company marketing as medical protocols. Purdue sales representatives received bonuses averaging $71,000 annually on top of base salaries, with top performers earning over $200,000 in commissions. The company paid out hundreds of millions in sales bonuses between 1996 and 2010, all tied directly to prescription volume. Representatives whose territories showed the largest prescription increases received awards, recognition, and opportunities for promotion. This compensation structure created overwhelming incentives to maximize prescriptions, regardless of medical appropriateness or patient outcomes. Sales reps weren't paid to ensure proper use, they were paid to move product. The Sackler family extracted more than $10 billion from Purdue between 1995 and 2015, moving money through a complex network of trusts and offshore accounts. They didn't simply take dividends from company profits, they paid themselves consulting fees, management fees, and various other payments that allowed extracting money while minimizing tax obligations. The family hired forensic accountants and lawyers specializing in asset protection, building financial structures designed to shield wealth from future liability. This financial engineering suggested the Sacklers anticipated legal problems and were preparing to insulate their personal fortunes. The family members maintained they were operating a legitimate pharmaceutical company, producing a legal medication approved by the FDA. This technically accurate statement ignored that the company's marketing had vastly expanded OxyContin prescribing beyond appropriate medical use through misrepresentation and aggressive promotion. Purdue wasn't simply filling legitimate demand. They were manufacturing demand through marketing campaigns that minimized risks and exaggerated benefits. The FDA approval provided legal cover for what was essentially mass distribution of an addictive drug to people who didn't need it. Between 1999 and 2010, prescription opioids including OxyContin killed more than 100,000 Americans. This death toll exceeded US combat deaths in the Vietnam War, yet the individuals and companies responsible faced minimal consequences. Purdue continued operating profitably. The Sackler family continued accumulating wealth. Their names appeared on museum wings, university buildings and hospital departments, cultural institutions grateful for philanthropic donations that came from opioid profits. The disconnect between the deaths and the accolades represented a fundamental failure of accountability. Purdue began facing lawsuits from families of overdose victims, counties struggling with addiction costs, and states seeking to recover healthcare expenses. The company's legal strategy was aggressive defense, fighting every claim, settling cases with confidentiality agreements that prevented public disclosure of internal documents. Early settlements required plaintiffs to agree never to discuss the case or share evidence they'd obtained through discovery. This allowed Purdue to contain information about their marketing practices, ensuring that damaging documents remained secret even as addiction and overdoses continued. The company hired elite law firms paying millions in legal fees to defend against liability. These firms employed hundreds of attorneys who spent years fighting discovery requests, filing motions to dismiss, and negotiating favorable settlements. Purdue treated litigation as a cost of doing business, an expected expense given the damage their product caused. The legal costs, while substantial, remained far smaller than OxyContin's profits. The company could afford to fight forever, while individual plaintiffs and small municipalities struggled to fund lengthy litigation. Some lawsuits revealed disturbing internal communications. Emails showed executives joking about addiction while celebrating sales milestones. Sales representatives described visits to pill mills that were obviously operating illegally, yet Purdue continued supplying these operations. Marketing materials included strategies for overcoming doctor objections about addiction without providing accurate information about actual risks. Each revelation made Purdue's knowledge and intent clearer. This wasn't negligent marketing, it was deliberate misrepresentation in pursuit of profits. The Sacklers hired crisis management firms and public relations specialists to protect their personal reputations as litigation intensified. These firms placed positive stories about the family's philanthropy, managed media inquiries, and worked to separate the Sackler name from Purdue's controversies. The strategy aimed to preserve the family's social standing while acknowledging Purdue faced legal challenges. The Sacklers wanted to maintain their position in high society, even as evidence emerged of their personal involvement in marketing decisions that created the opioid epidemic. Overdose deaths accelerated despite growing awareness of the crisis. The year 2010 saw 21,089 deaths involving prescription opioids, more than double the number from 2000. Americans were dying from prescription pills at rates that would have triggered massive regulatory intervention for any other cause of death. If a food product killed 21,000 people annually, it would be immediately recalled. If a vehicle defect caused those deaths, manufacturers would face criminal prosecution. But opioid deaths were treated differently, as a complex social problem without clear responsibility, rather than corporate misconduct causing mass casualties. Purdue exploited this framing, positioning themselves as part of the solution, while continuing to profit from the suffering they'd created. The United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Virginia opened a criminal investigation into Purdue Pharma in 2002, examining whether the company had illegally marketed OxyContin by making false claims about addiction risk. Federal prosecutors subpoenaed internal documents, interviewed former employees, and built a case that would take 5 years to complete. The investigation focused on the gap between what Purdue told doctors, that OxyContin had reduced abuse potential, and what the company's own scientists knew, that the time-release mechanism provided no proven addiction protection. Prosecutors discovered that Purdue had conducted no clinical studies supporting their safety claims before marketing began. The company had simply theorized that slower opioid release would reduce abuse, then marketed this speculation as established fact. Internal emails revealed executives discussing the lack of evidence while simultaneously approving marketing materials, making definitive safety claims. The prosecution team found training documents instructing sales representatives to cite the misleading FDA label language and the misinterpreted less than 1% statistic when doctors raised addiction concerns. 3 Purdue executives became targets of the criminal investigation: Michael Friedman, the company's president, Howard Udell, its general counsel, and Paul Goldenheim, its chief scientific officer. These men had overseen the marketing strategy, approved promotional materials, and received reports about abuse problems while continuing aggressive sales campaigns. Federal prosecutors believed they had knowingly participated in a scheme to defraud doctors and patients about OxyContin's safety. The potential charges included conspiracy to defraud the United States and misbranding a controlled substance. Purdue's legal team negotiated with prosecutors for years, seeking to minimize criminal exposure. The company wanted to avoid a trial that would expose internal documents and executive communications to public scrutiny. A trial would have meant testimony from former sales representatives, internal scientists, and company officials, testimony that could reveal the calculated nature of Purdue's deception. The company proposed a plea agreement where Purdue Pharma as a corporate entity would plead guilty to misbranding, but individual executives would face only misdemeanor charges. In May 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to 1 felony count of misbranding OxyContin with intent to defraud and mislead. The company admitted in court documents that it had marketed OxyContin as less addictive and less subject to abuse than other pain medications despite lacking clinical evidence for these claims. Purdue agreed to pay $634.5 million in fines and penalties, $470 million to federal and state governments, $130 million to settle civil liability, and $34.5 million in legal fees. At the time, it was one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in US history, but the settlement's details revealed its inadequacy. The 3 executives pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges of misbranding, received probation, and paid modest fines totaling $34.5 million from personal funds. No one went to prison. No Sackler family member was charged or even named in the prosecution. The plea agreement specifically stated that Purdue had engaged in illegal marketing, but carefully avoided implicating the owners who had directed that marketing. The company paid the fine from operating revenue, essentially an expense covered by ongoing OxyContin sales. Purdue continued operating under the same ownership with the same business model. The company remained the Sackler's property, generating billions in revenue. The guilty plea required Purdue to reform its marketing practices, but the agreement included no independent monitor to verify compliance. The company promised to stop making unsupported safety claims and to better track prescribing patterns that suggested abuse. These reforms amounted to promises to follow laws Purdue should have been following all along. The settlement included a corporate integrity agreement requiring Purdue to implement compliance programs and report suspicious prescribing to the DEA. But the company's interpretation of these obligations remained narrow. Purdue reported some obviously problematic doctors while continuing to supply pharmacies with suspicious ordering patterns. The reforms were theatrical, visible compliance measures that avoided disrupting the underlying business of maximizing OxyContin sales. Revenue barely declined after the settlement. The fine represented roughly 6 months of OxyContin profit. Federal prosecutors who handled the case later expressed frustration with the outcome. John Brownlee, the U.S. attorney who led the investigation, believed individual executives deserved prison time. His team had built a criminal case showing knowing and willful fraud, but Department of Justice officials in Washington pushed for a negotiated settlement rather than trial. The political pressure to avoid a lengthy, expensive prosecution of a major pharmaceutical company influenced the final agreement. Purdue's expensive legal team had successfully minimized consequences. The 2007 settlement should have ended the opioid epidemic by shutting down Purdue or forcing fundamental business changes. Instead, it functioned as a blueprint for managing liability. The company learned it could plead guilty to criminal charges, pay a fine, and continue operating profitably. The cost of breaking the law became a predictable business expense, factored into financial projections alongside manufacturing costs and marketing budgets. For the Sacklers, the settlement meant they could extract billions in profits, while the company they owned absorbed legal liability. State attorneys general began conducting their own investigations in the 2000s as prescription opioid deaths continued rising. Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey launched a particularly aggressive probe in 2014, demanding Purdue's internal documents and communications involving the Sackler family. Her office spent years fighting to obtain emails, memos, and board meeting minutes that would reveal the family's direct involvement in marketing decisions. Purdue fought every subpoena, arguing the Sacklers' communications were privileged and protected from disclosure. When Massachusetts finally obtained the documents through court orders, they revealed a family intimately involved in corporate strategy and marketing. Richard Sackler had personally directed marketing campaigns, questioned why sales weren't higher in specific regions, and pushed for more aggressive promotion despite knowing about addiction problems. Board meeting minutes showed Sackler family members discussing OxyContin sales figures, approving marketing budgets, and receiving detailed reports on the medication's performance. The family wasn't passively collecting dividends. They were managing the business that generated those profits. One particularly damning email showed Richard Sackler responding to reports of OxyContin abuse by suggesting the company needed to hammer on abusers in every way possible. His framing treated addicted patients as enemies, attacking Purdue's reputation rather than victims of the company's product. Another document revealed family members discussing how to turbocharge OxyContin sales in 2008, years after the criminal settlement and well into the documented epidemic. The Sacklers knew people were dying and wanted to sell more pills anyway. Massachusetts filed an expanded lawsuit in 2019 that named 8 Sackler family members as defendants, accusing them of personally directing fraudulent marketing and extracting billions while knowing their product was killing thousands. The complaint detailed the family's hands-on management, their knowledge of the crisis, and their decision to prioritize profits over lives. Other states had sued Purdue, but Massachusetts was the first to aggressively pursue the family itself, arguing that corporate liability shields shouldn't protect individuals who personally participated in deception. The Massachusetts lawsuit exposed the Sacklers' wealth extraction strategy. Between 2008 and 2018, the family had withdrawn more than $10 billion from Purdue through various mechanisms: dividends, consulting fees, payments for trademark licenses. The timing was revealing. The largest transfers occurred after the 2007 criminal settlement, when the family recognized legal liability was accelerating. They systematically moved money from the corporation to personal trusts and offshore accounts, insulating wealth from future judgments. This wasn't passive ownership. It was calculated asset protection. Purdue faced more than 2,000 lawsuits by 2019 from states, counties, cities, Native American tribes, hospitals, and families of overdose victims. The litigation documented similar patterns across the country: aggressive marketing based on false safety claims, targeting of vulnerable populations, continuation of sales to obviously problematic prescribers, and extraction of massive profits while communities collapsed. Each lawsuit added detail to the picture of corporate misconduct spanning 2 decades and causing hundreds of thousands of deaths. The Sackler name became synonymous with the opioid epidemic in public consciousness. Protesters demonstrated outside museums displaying the family name, demanding institutions return Sackler donations and remove their names from buildings. Photographers documented protests at the Guggenheim, the Met, and the Louvre, where activists scattered pill bottles and held signs reading "Shame on Sackler." The family's philanthropic legacy, the cultural prestige they'd purchased with opioid profits, crumbled as the death toll became undeniable. Museums began distancing themselves from the Sacklers in 2019. The Tate Galleries in London announced they would no longer accept Sackler donations. The Guggenheim removed the Sackler name from its education centre. The Louvre stopped listing the Sacklers in donor materials. These institutions had accepted millions from the family, used that money to fund exhibits and programs, and honoured the Sacklers as cultural benefactors. When the source of that wealth became public knowledge, the relationship became untenable. The Sackler family released carefully worded statements expressing regret about the opioid crisis while denying wrongdoing. They claimed to have acted legally and ethically in operating a legitimate pharmaceutical company. The statements emphasized that OxyContin was FDA approved, that the crisis involved many companies and factors, and that the family had already contributed to solutions through Purdue's 2007 settlement. The messaging avoided accepting responsibility, while acknowledging the tragedy in vague terms calculated to minimize legal exposure. Individual family members hired separate legal teams, recognizing their interests were diverging. Some Sacklers had been deeply involved in Purdue's management, while others had been passive beneficiaries receiving dividend distributions. Those with minimal involvement wanted to settle quickly and move on. Richard Sackler and other hands-on family members faced more serious liability, given their documented participation in marketing decisions. The family that had once presented a united front began fracturing under legal pressure. Documents revealed that Purdue had employed consultants from McKinsey & Company to advise on OxyContin marketing strategies. The consulting giant had recommended ways to turbocharge sales, suggested targeting specific physician groups, and proposed strategies for countering negative publicity about addiction. McKinsey's involvement showed how mainstream corporate institutions had participated in the epidemic, applying sophisticated business strategies to maximize opioid sales. The consulting firm later faced its own litigation and eventually paid $641 million to to settle claims it had helped Purdue boost sales despite knowing about overdose deaths. Purdue's board of directors included Sackler family members and outside directors who had overseen corporate strategy for years. Board minutes revealed they had received regular updates about litigation, regulatory investigations, and abuse problems. They'd approved marketing budgets, compensation plans for sales representatives, and financial transfers to the Sackler family. The board's fiduciary duty was theoretically to the corporation and its shareholders, but since the Sacklers were effectively the only shareholders, the board functioned primarily to serve family interests. Investigative journalists uncovered that Purdue had paid academic researchers to publish studies supporting long-term opioid therapy. These seemingly independent academic papers appeared in peer-reviewed journals, lending scientific credibility to aggressive opioid prescribing. The studies often had methodological limitations but reached conclusions favorable to increased opioid use. Purdue funded the research, suggested study designs, and sometimes even helped write the papers, then cited these publications as independent evidence in marketing materials. The cumulative picture that emerged from litigation and investigations showed a company that had industrialized deception. Purdue hadn't made isolated bad decisions or failed to recognize risks quickly enough. They had built a systematic operation to maximize opioid sales through misrepresentation, while creating legal and financial structures to protect profits from liability. Every element had been calculated: the marketing claims, the sales force structure, the funding of advocacy groups, the financial transfers to the Sackler family, and the legal strategies for managing litigation. By 2019, more than 400,000 Americans had died from opioid overdoses since OxyContin's launch. Prescription pills initially, then heroin and fentanyl as the epidemic evolved. The death toll exceeded US casualties in World War II. Communities across America had been devastated, families destroyed, and an entire generation scarred by addiction. The Sacklers remained billionaires. Purdue remained operational. Justice remained elusive. The settlement that should have ended the crisis in 2007 had instead taught pharmaceutical executives that even deadly fraud carried acceptable costs. Purdue Pharma filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on September 15, 2019, in White Plains, New York Federal Court. The filing wasn't a collapse driven by insolvency. It was a calculated legal strategy designed to consolidate all litigation into a single bankruptcy proceeding that Purdue could control. The company still generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue from OxyContin and other medications. The bankruptcy aimed to limit liability, cap payouts to victims, and most importantly, shield the Sackler family from future lawsuits while allowing them to retain billions. The bankruptcy proposal included a settlement framework where the Sacklers would contribute approximately $3 billion from their personal fortune in exchange for complete legal immunity from all current and future civil claims related to opioids. This immunity would extend to all family members, including those who'd never worked for Purdue, protecting wealth already extracted from the company over 2 decades. The proposal treated bankruptcy as a tool for buying protection, rather than a mechanism for fairly distributing assets to creditors and victims. Roughly 2,000 governmental entities and thousands of individual plaintiffs had filed claims against Purdue by the time of bankruptcy. These included states, counties, cities, school districts, hospitals, Native American tribes, and families who'd lost loved ones to overdoses. The claims totaled hundreds of billions in damages, costs for addiction treatment, emergency services, law enforcement, foster care for children whose parents overdosed, and wrongful death. Purdue's assets couldn't possibly satisfy these claims. which made bankruptcy a vehicle for negotiating how limited funds would be distributed. The bankruptcy court proceedings reveal the full extent of the Sacklers' wealth extraction. Between 2008 and 2018 alone, the family had withdrawn $10.7 billion from Purdue through dividends and other payments. They'd moved this money through a labyrinth of trusts, offshore accounts, and shell companies designed to make recovery difficult. Forensic accountants trace Sackler money to accounts in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and other jurisdictions with strong asset protection laws. The family had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, building financial fortifications around their wealth. Victims and their families packed bankruptcy hearings, many travelling to New York to confront the Sacklers and testify about their losses. Parents described finding their children dead from overdoses, holding photos of teenagers and young adults who'd started with OxyContin prescriptions and progressed to fatal addictions. Grandparents raising orphaned grandchildren after both parents overdosed detailed the emotional and financial devastation. Recovering addicts testified about years lost to addiction that began with legitimate pain prescriptions. The testimony was harrowing, but bankruptcy law operates on financial calculations rather than moral accountability. Several Sackler family members appeared at hearings via video conference from their homes in New York, Connecticut, and London. They offered scripted apologies expressing regret for the opioid crisis, while maintaining they'd acted legally and ethically. Richard Sackler testified he'd been a lawful board member of a legitimate pharmaceutical company. David Sackler, Richard's son, expressed sadness about the crisis but denied personal wrongdoing. The apologies felt hollow to victims watching billionaires apologize remotely from mansions purchased with profits from their loved ones' deaths. The Sacklers initially offered $3 billion spread over 9 years, keeping approximately $6 billion for themselves. This proposal generated outrage from state attorneys general and victims' advocates, who argued the family should forfeit their entire fortune given their role in creating the epidemic. The attorneys general from Massachusetts, New York, and other states pushed for a larger contribution, threatening to fight the bankruptcy settlement and pursue the family individually if necessary. Negotiations stretched across months as different parties fought over how much the Sacklers should pay. The Sackler family gradually increased their offer to $4.3 billion, then $4.5 billion, each increase presented as a generous concession, rather than accountability for causing hundreds of thousands of deaths. The negotiations revealed bankruptcy's fundamental inadequacy for addressing mass corporate harm. The process reduced questions of justice and responsibility to financial bargaining, treating deaths as line items on spreadsheets. Victims' lives were assigned dollar values through formulas, with individual death claims capped at amounts that wouldn't meaningfully compensate families for their losses. Judge Robert Drain, presiding over the bankruptcy case, faced an impossible situation. Bankruptcy law provided limited tools for punishing corporate wrongdoing. The process focused on distributing available assets to creditors, not on criminal accountability or moral judgment. Drain could reject the settlement and force Purdue into liquidation, but that might yield less money for victims if assets sold at fire sale prices. He could approve the settlement despite moral qualms, providing some compensation while granting the Sacklers immunity. Neither option delivered justice. In September 2021, Judge Drain approved a bankruptcy settlement giving the Sacklers broad immunity from civil liability in exchange for contributing $4.5 billion to be distributed among plaintiffs over 9 years. The settlement dissolved Purdue Pharma, transferring its assets to a new entity governed by a trust benefiting creditors and victims. The Sacklers would no longer own the company, but would keep over $6 billion in personal wealth. They admitted no wrongdoing as part of the agreement. The immunity provision barred future civil lawsuits against family members even from victims who hadn't participated in the bankruptcy proceedings. State attorneys general and the U.S. trustee's office immediately appealed, arguing that bankruptcy courts lacked authority to grant immunity to individuals who hadn't themselves filed for bankruptcy. The legal question was whether a company's bankruptcy could shield its owners from personal liability for alleged misconduct. The Sacklers hadn't filed for personal bankruptcy. They remained wealthy individuals seeking to use Purdue's bankruptcy to escape accountability. The appeals focused on this jurisdictional issue rather than the settlement's adequacy. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals reversed Judge Drain's approval in December 2021, ruling that bankruptcy law didn't authorize immunity for non-bankrupt parties like the Sackler family. The decision threw the settlement into chaos, leaving all parties without resolution. States couldn't pursue the Sacklers immediately because the bankruptcy stay remained in effect pending appeals, but the settlement that would have ended litigation was invalidated. The case entered legal limbo, with billions in promised payments frozen while courts debated procedural questions. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in 2023, considering whether bankruptcy law permitted the immunity arrangement. Oral arguments revealed deep divisions about balancing practical resolution against legal principles. Some justices seemed sympathetic to arguments that the settlement provided more compensation to victims than protracted litigation would yield. Others questioned whether wealthy individuals should escape accountability by using bankruptcy law as a shield. The case represented a broader question about whether the legal system could adequately address corporate misconduct causing mass casualties. While legal proceedings dragged on, the opioid epidemic evolved beyond prescription pills into a fentanyl crisis. Illicit fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, flooded American drug markets starting around 2013. Drug dealers mixed fentanyl into heroin supplies, pressed it into counterfeit pills resembling prescription medications, and sold it to users who often didn't know they were consuming such a powerful substance. The result was a dramatic increase in overdose deaths, from about 30,000 opioid-related deaths annually in 2015 to over 80,000 by 2021. The fentanyl crisis represented the opioid epidemic's third wave. First came prescription pills like OxyContin. Second came heroin use by people who'd started with prescriptions but switched to cheaper street drugs. Third came fentanyl contamination of the illicit drug supply, killing users who might have survived if consuming only heroin. Each wave was connected. Purdue's marketing had created the initial addiction population that sustained black markets now dominated by fentanyl. The company and the Sacklers bore responsibility for setting this cascade in motion. Total opioid overdose deaths exceeded 100,000 annually in the United States by 2021, a staggering death toll that would have been front-page news for months if caused by terrorism or infectious disease. But opioid deaths had become normalized, relegated to statistics rather than treated as the national emergency they represented. Communities had adjusted to the new reality of widespread addiction, memorial walls listing overdose victims, and naloxone carried by police and civilians to reverse overdoses. The crisis Purdue initiated had become permanent infrastructure. The Sackler family's wealth remained largely intact regardless of legal proceedings. Even if they ultimately paid $6 billion or more in settlements, the highest amount discussed in negotiations, they would retain billions already distributed and hidden in trusts and offshore accounts. Family members continued living in luxury, owning mansions in Manhattan, the Hamptons, London, and Gstaad. They travelled privately, collected art, and maintained social connections despite public controversy. The scale of their wealth insulated them from consequences that would devastate normal families. In June 2024, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the bankruptcy settlement granting Sackler immunity exceeded judicial authority. Justice Neil Gorsuch's majority opinion held that bankruptcy law didn't permit courts to eliminate creditors' claims against non-debtor third parties without unanimous consent. The decision rejected the proposed settlement, leaving litigation unresolved and the Sacklers exposed to potential civil lawsuits. States and victims could now pursue the family directly, rather than being forced into a bankruptcy settlement that capped their recovery. The Supreme Court decision reopened possibilities for accountability, but guaranteed years more litigation. States began preparing lawsuits against individual Sackler family members, seeking to pierce the corporate veil and hold them personally liable for deaths caused by OxyContin. The Sacklers' legal team prepared to fight these cases aggressively, using the same expensive lawyers and unlimited resources that had minimized consequences for 2 decades. The prospect of trials where Sackler family members testified under oath about their knowledge and decisions offered some hope for transparency. But legal accountability remained elusive. Civil lawsuits could extract money, but wouldn't result in criminal punishment. No prosecutor had successfully brought criminal charges against Sackler family members for their role in the epidemic. The 2007 criminal case against Purdue had carefully avoided charging the owners. Statutes of limitations on potential crimes were expiring. The prospect of Richard Sackler or other family members facing prison time appeared remote, despite overwhelming evidence of their knowing participation in deadly fraud. The bankruptcy settlement's collapse meant victims who'd expected compensation faced more years of uncertainty. Many had been counting on payments to cover treatment costs, medical bills, or wrongful death damages. The legal process had already consumed a decade with no resolution. Families who'd lost loved ones in the early 2000s had been waiting 20-plus years for accountability that still hadn't arrived. The system's inability to deliver swift justice compounded the initial harm. International legal proceedings added complexity. Some Sackler family members were British citizens living in the UK, potentially complicating enforcement of American judgments. The family's offshore financial structures involved multiple jurisdictions with varying cooperation levels. Recovering assets hidden in Swiss bank accounts or held through shell companies in Luxembourg would require international legal cooperation that could take years. The Sacklers had built financial defenses specifically designed to frustrate exactly this kind of pursuit. The opioid epidemic's death toll by 2024 exceeded 700,000 Americans since OxyContin's 1996 launch, more than the entire population of states like Wyoming or Vermont. The number dwarfed US military deaths in all wars since World War II combined. Life expectancy in the United States had declined for 3 consecutive years from 2015 to 2017, driven primarily by opioid overdoses, an almost unprecedented demographic shift in a wealthy nation during peacetime. The epidemic represented one of the greatest public health catastrophes in American history. The Sackler family issued statements through attorneys expressing willingness to contribute to opioid crisis solutions, while maintaining they'd broken no laws. Their framing suggested voluntary charitable contribution rather than accountability for harm caused. The family wanted the narrative to shift from criminal culpability to philanthropic problem-solving, repositioning themselves as part of the solution to a crisis they'd largely created. This messaging strategy aimed to preserve whatever remained of their social standing and potentially reduce final financial liability. Museums that had removed the Sackler name from buildings and galleries struggled with what to do about past donations. Some institutions returned money, though this seemed symbolically pointless. The funds had already been spent on programs and exhibits. Others kept the money but stripped the family's name from recognition. The cultural institutions faced impossible choices, having accepted millions from a family whose wealth came from deaths they had indirectly enabled. There was no clean resolution that erased the moral compromise. The Sackler family members showed varying levels of remorse and responsibility. Some appeared genuinely troubled by the epidemic and their family's role, though they maintained legal positions denying wrongdoing. Others seemed primarily concerned with protecting wealth and reputation. Richard Sackler's testimony and depositions revealed someone who saw himself as a victim of unfair persecution rather than an architect of mass death. The psychological disconnect between causing catastrophic harm and experiencing guilt remained striking. As of early 2025, no final settlement had been reached. The legal battle continued across multiple jurisdictions with thousands of parties. The Sacklers remained billionaires fighting to keep as much wealth as possible. Victims remained largely uncompensated. The opioid epidemic continued killing 100,000 plus Americans annually, though prescription pills now represented a small fraction compared to illicit fentanyl. The system that should have stopped Padue's marketing campaign in 1997 had failed for nearly 30 years. Justice delayed had become justice denied on a massive scale. The human cost of OxyContin extended far beyond overdose statistics into generational trauma that would affect American communities for decades. Children who grew up watching parents deteriorate into addiction carried psychological scars into adulthood, repeating patterns of substance abuse at rates far higher than the general population. The foster care system in states hardest hit by opioids remained overwhelmed. Kentucky's system held 10,000 children in 2024, triple the number from 2000, with parental drug addiction cited as the primary reason for removal in more than 70% of cases. Grandparents in their 60s and 70s found themselves raising elementary school children, draining retirement savings to provide food, clothing, and stability their addicted adult children couldn't offer. These grandparents often dealt with their own health problems, while managing behavioral and emotional issues in grandchildren traumatized by neglect and instability. Social service agencies lacked resources to support these kinship care arrangements adequately, leaving families to navigate complex custody proceedings and trauma responses without professional help. The economic damage to Appalachian communities compounded existing poverty and unemployment. Towns that had already struggled after coal mining declined and manufacturing jobs disappeared saw their remaining social cohesion destroyed by addiction. Local businesses closed as customer bases deteriorated. Property values collapsed in neighborhoods where abandoned houses with broken windows stood next to homes where families still tried to maintain normal lives. Young people with ambition and opportunity left for cities, creating brain drain that ensured these communities couldn't rebuild. Healthcare systems in rural areas faced permanent capacity problems created by the epidemic. Emergency rooms that had previously treated occasional accidents and heart attacks now function primarily as addiction crisis centers, with 40 to 50% of admissions involving opioid-related issues. Hospitals struggled financially because many opioid patients lacked insurance and couldn't pay for treatment. Medical staff experienced burnout from treating the same patients through repeated overdoses, infections from dirty needles, and complications from long-term opioid use. The epidemic revealed fundamental weaknesses in America's healthcare regulatory system. The FDA had approved OxyContin based on minimal clinical trials, accepted Padue's theoretical safety claims without demanding evidence, and failed to adequately monitor the medication after approval. When problems emerged, the agency responded slowly and ineffectively. The 2007 criminal case against Purdue should have triggered comprehensive FDA review of opioid approval and monitoring processes, but regulatory reforms remained modest and inadequate. The revolving door between pharmaceutical companies and regulatory agencies continued operating exactly as before. FDA officials still left government service for lucrative industry positions. Pharmaceutical companies still funded the medical research used to justify approval decisions. The fundamental conflicts of interest that enabled OxyContin's approval remained embedded in the system. No structural reforms prevented future companies from replicating Purdue's strategy of aggressive marketing based on minimal evidence and misrepresented safety data. The DEA's failure to control OxyContin distribution revealed another regulatory breakdown. The agency had legal authority to limit pharmaceutical manufacturing quotas and investigate suspicious distribution patterns. They'd seen the data showing small-town pharmacies ordering quantities that could only indicate diversion to black markets. Yet the DEA allowed pharmaceutical distributors to ship millions of pills to obviously problematic locations for years before taking enforcement action. The agency faced political pressure from pharmaceutical industry lobbying and lacked resources to effectively monitor the massive controlled substance distribution network. Pharmaceutical distributors, Cardinal Health, McKesson, and AmerisourceBergen, eventually faced their own litigation for shipping enormous quantities of opioids to suspicious locations without adequate monitoring. These companies operated the logistics networks connecting manufacturers like Purdue to pharmacies nationwide. Their computer systems flagged unusual orders, but the companies rarely refused shipments or notified authorities. They profited from moving pills regardless of whether those medications served legitimate medical purposes. The distributors eventually paid billions in settlements, but avoided criminal prosecution. Pharmacy chains, including CVS and Walgreens, faced lawsuits for filling prescriptions they should have recognized as inappropriate. The same patient filling prescriptions from multiple doctors, prescriptions written by physicians known to run pill mills, quantities inconsistent with legitimate medical use. Pharmacists have legal and ethical obligations to refuse questionable prescriptions, but corporate pressure to maximize sales and process prescriptions quickly undermined these professional responsibilities. Pharmacy employees who raised concerns about suspicious prescriptions reported being overruled by managers focused on customer service metrics and revenue. The medical profession's complicity in the epidemic extended beyond individual doctors to medical associations and specialty societies. Organizations like the American Pain Society and American Academy of Pain Medicine had promoted aggressive opioid prescribing throughout the 1990s and 2000s, often with pharmaceutical industry funding. These professional societies presented long-term opioid therapy as evidence-based treatment when the actual evidence was weak and conflicting. They'd helped create the clinical environment where prescribing powerful opioids for chronic non-cancer pain became standard practice. Medical education had failed to prepare doctors to recognize and manage addiction. Most physicians received minimal training in addiction medicine during medical school and residency. They learned pharmacology, but not the behavioral and neurological aspects of substance use disorders. When patients developed opioid dependence, doctors often lacked knowledge to distinguish physical dependence from addiction, or skills to initiate addiction treatment. This educational gap meant the physicians prescribing millions of OxyContin pills were fundamentally unprepared to manage the consequences. Insurance companies and government health programs had incentivized opioid prescribing by covering pills while limiting access to alternative pain treatments. Physical therapy, exercise programs, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other non-pharmacological pain management approaches often required prior authorization or faced coverage limitations. But prescribing OxyContin took 5 minutes and was automatically covered. The reimbursement structure made pills the easiest option for time-pressed doctors and the cheapest option for insurers in the short term, though the long-term costs of addiction dwarfed any savings. The pharmaceutical industry's broader business model, maximizing sales of patent-protected medications through aggressive marketing, created systemic incentives for behavior like Purdue's. Every pharmaceutical company faced pressure to maximize revenue during the limited years of patent exclusivity before generic competition emerged. This encouraged companies to overstate benefits, minimize risks, and expand indications to the largest possible patient populations. Purdue's marketing was extreme, but not fundamentally different from standard industry practices. The legal system's inadequacy became clear through the decades-long failure to deliver accountability. Civil litigation could potentially extract billions from defendants, but couldn't imprison executives or deter future misconduct effectively. Criminal prosecution faced high evidentiary standards and political obstacles to charging wealthy, well-connected defendants. Regulatory agencies could impose fines, but lacked authority to dismantle companies or permanently ban individuals from the pharmaceutical industry. No single component of the legal system could adequately address corporate misconduct causing mass casualties. The question of how much money could compensate for a dead child or destroyed life revealed the fundamental impossibility of making victims whole through settlements. No financial payment could bring back people who'd overdosed or restore years lost to addiction. The bankruptcy proceedings' reduction of human tragedy to spreadsheets and formulas highlighted how poorly the legal system handled mass harm. Victims weren't seeking equivalent value for losses. They wanted acknowledgement, accountability, and prevention of future harm, none of which settlements delivered. The Sackler family's escape from criminal prosecution, despite overwhelming evidence of knowing participation in deadly fraud, exposed wealth's protective power. Poor individuals selling opioids on street corners faced decades in prison, while billionaires who'd orchestrated the distribution of millions of pills remained free. The disparity revealed that American justice operated on a tiered system where sufficient wealth could buy freedom from consequences that would destroy ordinary people. The Sacklers had excellent lawyers, political connections, and resources to fight indefinitely, advantages unavailable to typical defendants. The opioid epidemic's evolution into a fentanyl crisis ensured that Purdue's initial crime would continue killing people long after OxyContin prescribing declined. The addiction population created by prescription pills provided a market for increasingly dangerous street drugs. Drug trafficking organizations responded to this demand by producing fentanyl, which was cheaper and more profitable than heroin. The result was a drug supply contaminated with substances so powerful that single dosing errors caused death. Purdue had set in motion forces that would keep killing Americans for generations. Naloxone distribution programs emerged as a harm reduction strategy, providing the opioid overdose reversal drug to likely bystanders, friends and family of people who use drugs, first responders, community organizations. Naloxone could save lives when administered quickly after overdose, blocking opioid receptors and restoring breathing. But relying on naloxone to address the epidemic was treating symptoms rather than causes. It saved individuals while leaving the addiction crisis fundamentally unresolved. Medication-assisted treatment with buprenorphine or methadone offered the most effective intervention for opioid addiction, with evidence showing significantly better outcomes than abstinence-based approaches. But access remained limited due to regulatory restrictions, stigma, and lack of trained providers. Many rural counties had no physician certified to prescribe buprenorphine. Methadone clinics faced zoning restrictions and community opposition. The treatment infrastructure couldn't meet demand created by an epidemic affecting millions. The criminal justice system remained overwhelmed by opioid-related offences while lacking resources to address addiction underlying criminal behavior. Jails and prisons filled with people arrested for drug possession, theft to support addiction, and drug dealing. Incarceration typically worsened outcomes. People lost housing and employment, developed criminal networks, and experienced trauma without receiving addiction treatment. Upon release, they faced barriers to employment and housing that made relapse nearly inevitable. The cycle of addiction, incarceration, and release repeated endlessly. Some communities experimented with drug courts and diversion programs offering treatment instead of incarceration for non-violent offenders. These programs showed promise but required substantial resources and couldn't scale to epidemic proportions. The fundamental mismatch persisted, treating addiction as a criminal justice problem when it required public health interventions. The legal system lacked tools to effectively address mass drug addiction, yet society continued relying on law enforcement and courts to manage the crisis. The political response to the opioid epidemic remained inadequate despite bipartisan acknowledgement of the crisis. Congress authorized billions in emergency funding for addiction treatment and prevention programs, but these amounts represented small fractions of the economic damage. Federal legislation created new restrictions on opioid prescribing and improved prescription monitoring, but these measures came years after the epidemic had established itself. Politicians gave speeches and held hearings, but avoided structural reforms that might confront pharmaceutical industry political power. Pharmaceutical industry lobbying remained enormously influential in Washington and state capitals. The industry spent hundreds of millions annually on political contributions and lobbying, ensuring friendly legislation and fighting regulations that might limit profits. PHRMA, the industry's main lobbying group, opposed prescription monitoring programs, prescribing limits, and enhanced FDA oversight, measures that might have reduced opioid deaths but would also reduce pharmaceutical sales. The industry's political power helped explain why regulatory reforms remained modest, despite catastrophic public health consequences. The Sackler family's philanthropy had purchased not just museum wings but political protection. Family members and Purdue had donated to politicians from both parties, building relationships that deterred aggressive regulatory action. The donations weren't necessarily explicit quid pro quo. They created environments where politicians viewed pharmaceutical companies as job creators and innovators rather than potential threats to public health. This political capital helped Purdue avoid serious federal intervention until the epidemic had killed hundreds of thousands. The question of whether capitalism and adequate pharmaceutical regulation could coexist went largely unexamined. The profit motive incentivized companies to maximize sales regardless of consequences. Regulatory capture occurred naturally when industries funded politicians and employed former regulators. The system that produced the opioid epidemic remained fundamentally intact, capable of generating similar crises with different medications or different industries. No structural reforms addressed the underlying problem of profit-driven corporations controlling products that could kill massive numbers of people. The opioid epidemic's racial dynamics revealed troubling patterns in how American society responds to drug crises. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s to 90s, which primarily affected black urban communities, prompted harsh criminal penalties and mass incarceration. The opioid epidemic, predominantly affecting white rural and suburban populations, generated sympathy and calls for treatment rather than punishment. The different responses to chemically similar crises, both involving addiction to central nervous system drugs, exposed racial double standards in drug policy and criminal justice. Some analysts suggested the opioid epidemic finally created political will for criminal justice reform and drug policy changes because it affected white communities that politicians couldn't ignore. This explanation, while politically astute, highlighted the injustice of systems that only changed when white Americans suffered consequences previously inflicted primarily on black communities. The shift from punitive to treatment-oriented drug policy was welcome, but arrived decades too late, and only after the racial demographics of drug addiction changed. The long-term public health implications extended beyond direct overdose deaths into chronic conditions affecting millions. Hepatitis C transmission from shared needles created a new epidemic within the opioid epidemic. 250,000 new hepatitis C infections between 2004 to 2014, primarily among young white adults in rural areas where injection drug use had been rare. HIV transmission also increased in several states due to injection practices among people who'd started with prescription pills. These infectious disease outbreaks represented secondary consequences that would require treatment resources for decades. The psychological impact on communities that watched neighbors, friends and family members die from overdoses created collective trauma requiring mental health interventions that mostly didn't exist. Entire towns had experienced losses comparable to wartime casualty rates. Children grew up seeing memorial walls listing overdose victims, attending funerals of classmates, understanding death from a young age. The normalization of overdose deaths as routine occurrences represented a profound social pathology that would shape these communities' character for generations. The question of whether the epidemic could have been prevented has a clear answer. Yes, at multiple intervention points. The FDA could have demanded evidence before approving claims about reduced abuse potential. The DEA could have restricted manufacturing quotas and enforced distribution controls. State medical boards could have sanctioned physicians running pill mills. Purdue could have marketed honestly instead of fraudulently. The Sackler family could have prioritized lives over profits. At every stage, individuals and institutions made choices that prioritized pharmaceutical industry interests over public health. The epidemic wasn't an accident. It was the predictable result of regulatory capture, corporate greed, and systemic failure. The uncomfortable truth was that American institutions, regulatory agencies, medical profession, pharmaceutical industry, legal system, political leadership had failed catastrophically and fundamentally. The failure wasn't a matter of isolated bad actors or unfortunate oversights. The system operated exactly as designed, prioritizing corporate profits and protecting wealthy defendants while hundreds of thousands died. The OxyContin epidemic revealed that these institutions couldn't or wouldn't protect public health, when doing so conflicted with powerful economic interests. The Sackler family's continued wealth and freedom represented the starkest symbol of this failure. They had personally directed marketing campaigns they knew would addict and kill people. They had extracted billions while communities collapsed. They had hidden wealth in offshore accounts to evade accountability, yet they remained billionaires living comfortably, hosting gatherings, traveling internationally, and experiencing only the minor inconvenience of having their names removed from museums. The contrast between their lives and the devastation they'd caused was obscene. The opioid epidemic continues. Over 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2023, primarily involving fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. The crisis Purdue initiated in 1996 had evolved through prescription pills, heroin, and fentanyl, but the fundamental problem, mass addiction to opioids, persisted nearly 3 decades later. The systems that enabled OxyContin remain unchanged. Pharmaceutical companies still aggressively market potentially dangerous medications. Regulators still maintain cozy relationships with industries they supposedly oversee. Profit still outweighs human life in American healthcare. The OxyContin story isn't history, it's present and ongoing. The deaths continue, The legal battles continue. The Sacklers remain billionaires. Justice remains elusive. And the next pharmaceutical company considering whether to market a potentially harmful drug aggressively now has a clear precedent. Even if your product kills hundreds of thousands, even if your fraud is documented, even if you personally directed the misconduct, you can pay fines and keep your fortune. The cost of killing Americans has been calculated, and for companies and families wealthy enough, it's acceptable.